So I was speaking to Jack's Blade earlier, and he brought up an interesting idea for a video topic, and this is actually whether or not Future Vegeta actually went to hell. Now, I feel like a lot of you watching this video think that, and when we look at a basic life review of Future Vegeta, the first question that we have is, did he redeem himself against the androids? Because once Goku died of a heart virus, Vegeta was just basically living on Earth until the androids showed up and eventually killed him. In all likelihood, Vegeta probably just noticed that there was a threat on Earth, and obviously with his Saiyan pride and wanting to test himself, he encountered the threat, and unfortunately, depending on which versions you see, Vegeta was killed in different ways, but he was unsuccessful and eventually died. Now, the other thing that we also have to point out too is we have to compare the future version of Vegeta to the present version of Vegeta, and when you look at the present version of Vegeta, his maturation process into becoming a quote-unquote good guy was rather slow, because even if you look at Vegeta throughout Dragon Ball Z, obviously he was a villain in the Saiyan arc, he was a villain for a portion of the Namek arc, and then in the Android arc, he was not necessarily a hero, he was just kind of like an anti-hero that you want on your side because he's strong enough to fight against, you know, some of the main villains, and as a result of that, it kind of put Vegeta in a weird limbo class. So, because of all of these differences between the present version of Vegeta and the future version of Vegeta, the present version of Vegeta had opportunities to go through different events that quote-unquote softened his heart and made him quote-unquote nicer. You know, if we look at a specific instance, we can analyze when Gohan risked his life for him, and obviously, you know, Vegeta helped Gohan out later in the Beam Clash against Cell, obviously, so that was a major part of Vegeta redeeming himself, because that was a moment where Vegeta did it for a very altruistic reason. He was doing it for the betterment of anyone. Now, obviously, this includes himself, because if Gohan loses the Beam Clash, that means he's gonna die too. But at least in this particular situation, we can say that Vegeta went past his pride, went past the fact that this was a kid that surpassed him and was the son of his rival, which was very humiliating for Vegeta when you consider the fact that not only were you not strong enough to pass your rival, but then the rival's son actually passes you. He had to swallow a lot of pride to do this. And then we also factor in the situation with Future Trunks. Future Trunks bonded with him, and because of that, Vegeta raged out against Cell when Trunks had died, and that was also a major turning point into Vegeta quote-unquote changing his heart. So, when we look at all of this, we have to really deduce what kind of life did Future Vegeta really have. Well, after the death of Goku, he was probably a lot less motivated to train and fight, even though, because of his Saiyan instincts, I'm sure that he would still want to be the strongest and maintain his presence amongst the strongest Z fighters, so he would still train, but he wouldn't have that burning drive that he had in the present timeline, where he actually surpassed Goku after 3 years of training, and because of this, the situation was completely different, but he would still probably be a character that would still go out and train and do all of that, just not to the same degree that he did before, because he doesn't have Goku to directly measure himself against. And obviously, if he's using Goku as a success factor, that's a major part of his life, but he didn't get to do this for too long because the androids obviously killed him. Now, the other thing is tying into what kind of life Future Vegeta had, we have to point out that whether or not he achieved Super Saiyan is kind of up for debate, because if you look at the anime versions, when you look at the history of Trunks, and then when you look at filler episode Goes From Tomorrow in episode 164, you can see that in the small flashback, Vegeta actually was able to turn into a Super Saiyan when he was fighting against Android 17. So this now brings up a question of, well, what was originally meant in the manga? In the manga, it was just never said, and the anime version basically just took liberties. But funny enough, when you look at what we see in Dragon Ball Super and that small manga snippet that explains what happened when the androids killed all of the Z fighters and how future Gohan survived, you could actually see that Vegeta was fighting against the androids in his base form in the background, and this might be that the androids beat him up so badly that they knocked him out of Super Saiyan, or he just was never able to actually turn Super Saiyan in that particular timeline. Now, when we look at all of this and compare this with the Buu Saga version of Vegeta, the Buu Saga Vegeta took monumentally good actions, because even though he sacrificed himself in a noble way against Fat Buu and it was ultimately unsuccessful, he came back, planned out how he was going to defeat Kid Buu by the Spirit Bomb and trying to get all the Earthlings to work together and all of that. And through those deeds and through bravely fighting against Kid Buu, I feel like the key reason why Vegeta was able to really redeem himself was in those fights. Vegeta was fighting purely altruistically, because when you think about it, here is a dead guy. He has nothing to gain. He's already dead, so everything that he's doing is for the benefit of other people, because he didn't know at that particular point that he was going to get another life. And then when you also factor in that Vegeta was fighting losing battles intentionally for the betterment of others, that also gives more cause for him, because when you think about it, when he fought against Kid Buu, he knew he stood no chance, because Goku was struggling to defeat Kid Buu as a Super Saiyan 3, and Vegeta knew he wasn't as strong as Goku. So as a result of that, Vegeta knew he couldn't defeat Kid Buu, so the whole fight, he knew he was just trying to buy time, which goes more into showing how altruistic Vegeta was in those battles, and that was a very, very key changing point that made him very different from the actions he took earlier when he obviously became Majin Vegeta, and unfortunately killed a lot of innocent people in the World Tournament. But most importantly, we also have to factor in the family, because this version of Vegeta had virtually no interest in Bulma or Trunks. And this is really important, because when we look at what future Bulma said about Vegeta when Trunks had gone to the past and spoken about what his father had done for him, Bulma was shocked to hear what Trunks was saying, and obviously this is because the version of Vegeta that she knew would have never have done things like that, because he didn't go through those acts in the present timeline to change who he actually was. When you combine this with what Trunks said about Vegeta and Bulma originally when he was speaking to Goku when he first met him, he basically just said how Bulma and Vegeta were a fling, and they basically never really had like a long-term kind of relationship, and that Yamcha was eventually going to break up with Bulma. So, looking at it like this and comparing this to the present version of Vegeta who actually lived with Bulma, it was never shown that they got married, but when you combine that and the fact that obviously Trunks grows up with his father, very different from the type of family that Trunks would have had in the future timeline, even if the androids had never attacked, considering the fact that the future version of Vegeta wouldn't have cared about the future version of Trunks, this all in all would show that even from a family point of view, he wouldn't have been a good guy, or at least a caring guy, about his most closest loved ones. And from Vegeta's perspective, it makes very logical sense to think that he would just look at Bulma as essentially an intelligent sex object that he could procreate with and use her technology, because other than that, what other usage would Vegeta have in Bulma? I mean, he wants to use her technology to better himself, and obviously, you know, when you gotta do what you gotta do, I mean, Bulma's obviously not a bad option. Now, it's unclear whether or not Vegeta ever used a gravity chamber in the future timeline, and had he used it, it might have changed how badly he lost to the androids, even though he still would have lost, considering the gap that the androids had over him. It is important to note that if Vegeta had anything with Bulma at all, it's only for his benefit, and not really to give her anything out of it, except for her own pleasure. So ultimately, when it comes to deciding whether or not future Vegeta went to hell, it makes the most sense to say that he probably did, because he was an evil character before and then became a neutral character, where he wasn't necessarily actively aggressive towards Earth and all of the characters there, because Goku was gone and he didn't really have any motivation, so he wasn't really actively trying to kill them and get rid of them. But at the same time, though, he wasn't really good. So when you look at that and combine that with all the things that he had done before, there really is no case to make that Vegeta is a quote-unquote good guy, because everything that he ever did was for his own selfish desires and for himself to survive. To be frank, the only reason why Vegeta probably even stayed on Earth is because there really was nowhere else for him to go at that particular point of his life. Now, as a post-edit, it's important to mention that deciding whether or not Vegeta goes to hell is very similar to the Darth Vader complex. And many months ago, I briefly played a mobile game called Judgment Day, where they basically take a lot of other characters from real life or fiction, and you basically decide whether or not you think this character should go to hell. So for example, there's Walter White, there's Goku, there's Michael Jordan, there's a bunch of different characters and previous dictators of the past that you could decide on. And Darth Vader was always weird for me, because I always felt like, yeah, what Vader did is worthy of him going to hell, but at the same exact time, he technically also saved the universe. So does the weight of what he did in the end outweigh his transgressions? And that's very similar to what we see in the situation with Vegeta on the planet of Demise. Does the weight of what he did in the Kid Buu fight outweigh all of the horrible deeds that he did in the past? Just some food for thought.